Welcome to Maintainable, the podcast where we explore the art, and sometimes the mess, of software that lasts. We speak with seasoned practitioners who have helped navigate technical debt, untangle legacy code, and help teams build sustainable and resilient systems. Because good software isn't just about shipping fast, it's about making it last. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. On this episode, we're joined by Nathan Ladd, principal at Brightworks Digital with 2 decades in the software industry. We talk about how teams establish and maintain their current standards and norms, the importance of keeping all of your problems on the radar, and the influence of who we seek validation from. Interesting topic. Nathan also shares a story of migrating a React single-page app to Turbo and Stimulus and how that shift removed barriers between their designers and engineering team. We also dig into his work on TestBench and other lessons learned from years of working with legacy systems. Nathan joins us from wherever his RV happens to be parked. Nathan Ladd, welcome to Maintainable.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Well, first, I would qualify perfectly maintained software as like a platonic ideal would actually just be software that isn't maintained at all. And so the way I think of it is a reduction of maintenance is the kind of target. Of course, that's the challenge of software development. But to be more specific, I think number one, if a team is keeping dependencies up to date regularly, that's an important indicator. 2, I would say that the code pervasively comports to the team's norms and standards. And the 3rd one I would say is defects are fixed immediately when they're first spotted and not deferred to be dealt with later.
Can you tell us a bit more about the norms and standards of the team at the moment?
Yeah, I think these can range from sort of the very crude standards, crude not as a pejorative, but just in terms of a characteristic. The things that RuboCop can detect are by their nature crude, as an example. So if your team has agreed, we always use double quotes for strings, never a reason to use single quotes, for example. That would be an example of a norm that your social fabric, your culture has agreed to. And you can expect, therefore, to regard any single quoted string as a defect. And now this delineation, or not delineation, but this concept of the team's norms and standards, it starts in crude places like that, but it can actually become a lot more intractable for tools to really be able to detect. So we have a lot of, on our projects, norms, standards, and customs for how we, for example, phrase the terminology that goes into our test contexts and our test titles, like describe and context blocks in RSpec. And for the most part, a lot of those sensibilities are not really even able to be written down. I mean, they could be as a book, but because nobody has time to just sit down and write a book about this stuff, you just sort of have to develop your practice and share with the people you're working with. And you kind of build tacit knowledge within the group about how do we do things? How do we approach problems? That's where we kind of leave behind the tools and have to really treat it as more of a social or a people problem.
Right. I'm curious, have you had many experiences where that type of, those patterns that a team might have, that there's been a very intentional thing that's happened within the team years down the road? Or do you get a sense that a lot of those standards, norms are kind of implemented from the beginning by those original few developers that work on it?
I will say, of course, I've seen kind of a lot of different kinds of teams. Yes, I've definitely worked on projects where if you know the 1 or 2 developers who were involved early, who were hacking the app away at a coffee shop on nights and weekends, if you know who those people are, you can answer a lot of questions you might have about the code base. But I've also, I think, been on teams more recently where there's a deliberate intention to not just install a culture, but to begin with a strongly cohesive culture and really endeavor to sustain consensus over time to the point where the standards and norms and practices and the praxis can all evolve as the team sees fit, with kind of sub-measurement of everybody gets to participate, but also, of course, you need a final court of appeal because we're humans are going to end up with conflicting and competing claims about maybe the right way to do one thing or another. And actually, I would say, to my point earlier about RuboCop and or more broadly the specific practices and standards that we would call more crude, with high enough team cohesion, we found that teams can kind of develop a sense that they all understand the way even simple Ruby methods are to be expressed without actually having to involve tools. And so I've been really inspired by seeing the extent to which humans that come together and work on the same mission together and have a cohesive culture can do a lot of things that I think a lot of people say are sort of impractical for growing teams. A lot of people say, I hear this a lot, what you're saying can work in the beginning when everything's very small, the team's small, but over time, eventually you need guardrails, you need pull requests, you need TypeScript or sorbet, or you need all these things that are going to help preserve maintainability. But I think a big lesson in my career in the last 5-10 years has been, don't sleep on a team that knows how to work together and knows how to maintain alignment and really work through the very difficult work of figuring out how to build agreement and buy-in from people who might have different opinions going into things.
Shouldn't we just all be able to hire the people that are the most like how we approach and think about things, and this should just be simple? I'm being facetious there.
Well, I mean, yeah. If you want to build a monoculture, that is the challenge actually, because if you do, I think almost as an extension of the old agile adage, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I think if you extend that to groups of people, if you have more of a monoculture, then you can go fast in the way an individual can go fast at the expense of perhaps being unable to go as far in the way that consensus helps you get there. So starting off with a small core tight-knit group of people who work well together and have a lot of established history is actually a good starting point. I think the crucial thing about taking that approach is to make sure that as you bring new people on and introduce them to the culture, yes, they have to learn the ropes and they have to accept as an imposition whatever norms and standards have been brought before. And I'm often finding myself saying, if you have an idea for how to do something better that we've done many, many times before, it needs to be better enough to justify the cost of getting us to the point where it's as if we did it that way all along. And so the key is, I think, everybody coming in has to understand that they're joining a team that already has a pretty well-established way of doing things. It takes some time before any one person might start to really contribute back. But at the same time, we never want to create a situation where if you happen to be one of the early people, that you have a sort of a privileged view about the way things ought to be done. And anybody who's new just has to accept your way of doing it. So there's a balancing act there that just requires a lot of good attitudes about how people interact with one another and how they treat having conflicting viewpoints.
Hey listeners, it's Robbie here. It wasn't all that long ago. I'd find myself debugging a weird issue in one of our clients' Rails app. I log into one platform to track down the error, only to realize it was tied to some performance issue. And guess what? That meant hopping over into a completely different tool and trying to match things up based off of timestamps, if I was lucky. And let me tell you, my productivity didn't exactly thank me for that. Enter AppSignal, our podcast sponsor, and the tool that eliminates all that back and forth. They bring error tracking, performance monitoring, host metrics, custom metrics, uptime monitoring, and logging into one seamless platform. It's a single source of truth that helps keep your app running like a well-rehearsed symphony. Whether you're working with Ruby, Elixir, Node, Python, or tracking front-end errors in JavaScript, AppSignal has your back. They're always adding support for more languages and frameworks too. And here's the best part. AppSignal won't break the bank. Plans start at just $23 US a month. Plus, they're ISO 27001 certified and fully GDPR and HIPAA compliant, so your data is safe. Oh, and because you're a loyal Maintainable listener, you can use the promo code Maintainable at checkout for 10% off your first year. So head over to appsignal.com, tell them that your good friend Robbie from Maintainable sent you, and start making your app sing. You brought up a lot of really good points there, and I've been exposed to lots of different teams with different situations where, or maybe like maybe those original developers have come and gone, right, from an organization, and they've had like the second or third, I'm trying to think of the right way to, team working on like version of that development team is there now. And so someone joining the company, it feels like sometimes in those environments, like it feels a little rudderless in a way, because I think everybody's kind of like, well, we're all maintaining this software project. It's been successful enough that we can all get hired here, which is great, but nobody's made any like new big architectural decisions in a long time. We've not felt very comfortable rethinking how some of those original architecture things were done, or revisiting the dependencies that our apps use, because we don't fully understand all the rationale. There's no one in the corner being like, oh, this is why we chose X, Y, and Z, and this is there's like almost an assumption that like, well, the people that were here before us knew what they were doing. Maybe not. Maybe we definitely have also heard the other, like, we don't know what they were thinking, and this was all crazy, and this is a big mess now. But there's like, I've seen both spectrums kind of struggle to be like, how do we start improving things for ourselves now that this is our responsibility and not just the responsibility of the people that were here before us? Have you been exposed to much of that yourself?
Yeah, I'm thinking about a company I worked at probably close to 15 years ago now, where there was definitely a very ambitious project that was undertaken by a small number of developers who were very gifted and prolific, who built out a very dynamic, customizable, fully configurable sort of workflow engine for a very enterprisey application. I think it was human resources. And it was sort of developed as a prototype to displace a legacy implementation. But there was really, if you asked the original authors, what's our architecture style? It's the Rails way, MVC. And ultimately, I mean, there was definitely a lot of initial design that happened, but the old adage, no plan survives contact with the opponent. You dream up a really awesome way of solving a problem, implement it, and then find out, or you can find out, oh man, this needs a lot of adaptation and retrofitting to actually work in the real world. And so on the team, by the time I had joined, all the original folks had left the team for a while. So there was the sense that, okay, look, we need to own the architecture and the implementation. And I think that's a pretty crucial point about maintainability, actually, that we learn what makes code more maintainable when we agree to maintain it. When we decide that, for example, we're going to defer making architectural decisions, or we're going to avoid making architectural decisions because we're not really sure why the code was implemented in the way it was, that is although we can see something commendable about it, like I don't want to believe that I'm the smartest person in the world. I want to accept that the people who built it this way might have had some insight that I don't have. Like, that's commendable. There's humility in it. But underneath it, there's also a bit of an abnegation of the responsibility to be the maintainer. And so sooner or later, you have to be making the decisions that are going to determine the degree to which in the future your team's spending its time building new features or spending its time in maintenance,
Right. In preparing for this conversation, I know that you've also kind of described the compounding effects of neglect in these older code bases. We talked about dependencies already. You talked a little bit about standards, and you also touched on defects in particular. And I thought that was something I thought was interesting, where you're like, they need to be able to be addressed immediately. And I know a lot of teams, projects that we're even exposed to quite often, like there's just things coming in from whatever, insert, Sentry, App Signal, whatever, a lot of them coming in throughout the day. And the teams have had to figure out which ones are most pressing to deal with, and knowing that they can't get to everything. So what do you think kind of gets teams into that situation where they're like having to prioritize which of the weird anomalies they need to focus on versus just like anything should just be addressed?
Well, I think that in a sense, a way to look at it is, and I want to make sure I'm saying this in a way that isn't prone to lose some fidelity, but in a sense, you can look at it like there's an infinite number of defects. For example, if a team decides that double quoted strings everywhere is the way to go, now everywhere you've got single quoted strings, you have a defect. It's important not to think of defects as merely malfunctions that impact end users. Everything that is not what you'd like it to be, and to put a finer point on it, everything that impedes our ability to do our work objectively is itself a defect. So I think each one of those 3 points, I put it on a scale. So if I say, number one, a well-maintained product doesn't have any old dependencies that aren't desirable anymore. There's a range there. If on the extreme end, if my project depends on a CMS plugin that only works on Rails 3 and it was never updated after that, and my whole Rails app is stuck on Rails 3 because of that one CMS plugin, that's a very extreme case of a dependency causing all sorts of other problems. That's like almost the spanner stuck into the wheel kind of problem. But there also are dependencies that are less desirable than they could be because improvements to those dependencies have been identified, but they haven't been carried out. Maintaining a test framework, there's I've got a list of things I'd like to add or take away when I get the time, and so ultimately old dependencies, there's a spectrum here. Similarly, what do we mean by a team is able to keep all of its code into adherence with current norms and standards? Well, this actually it also is on a spectrum in the sense that when the team develops a consensus around the way that we structure our tests or the way we structure our projects, the way that we apply design principles in practice, what we've learned from that. When a team is learning more and more things about the way the way that they find most effective, then that team is also developing new norms and standards all the time. And so you're always catching up to what you've just learned. And similarly, a lot of teams are at a place where any defect that's not impacting a customer, there's absolutely no time to address it. And then from there, you can have teams that I would say or qualify and say are in a healthier place. They have the ability to focus on less severe forms of defects that still ought to be corrected. And so put all that together, there isn't a project I've ever worked on that doesn't have all three of these characteristics. The difference is how deep do I have to sort of dial in the microscope before I see problems? Like a professional athlete makes mistakes all the time, but they don't make the same mistakes that the folks at the gym at the rec center make.
I'd love to switch gears a little bit with you. And in preparing for the conversation, I came across a story about a project where your team moved away from a React single-page app to a much simpler, in your words, turbo-based approach. So can you walk us through, A, what prompted that change, and I probably have some more topics after that.
Yeah, I guess I'll preface this by saying the gist of this story is that there were kind of two problems, one more technical in nature and one more socio-technical or social in nature. And they were both impacting arguably maintainability. And so looking at them together as part of the bigger picture made it sort of illuminated a path that made it fairly straightforward to address both of the problems at once. So I was brought into a project that had started building a web application, and the team had chosen to go with a Rails API with a React single page app. That was very, very common at the time. We had also, just in the way the whole project management structure had formed, we had a separate design team that was kind of working in isolation that was developing very elaborate visual designs that I'm sure looked wonderful in their portfolios. They were very elaborate and called for tons of interactivity, and they were handing them off to the development team. And nobody had really ever assessed objectively whether our end users need high interactivity. There was a sense that, we just want it to pop, which is always a little bit disturbing to hear.
No comment.
But yeah, the React application was already proving to be a cost center for both of those reasons. Single page apps, and the distributed objects that they typically entail, they're kind of notoriously expensive. And a lot of those designs, as one might guess, ended up being kind of impractical when they went to be implemented and needed a lot of rework after the fact, which is always undesirable. And this was an opportunity. There was an opportunity then to kind of look at Turbo and Stimulus and check it out. I remember Rails 2 is when I started using Ruby, and the way back then that you would do JavaScript was sprinkles. Like you would generally build a partial HTML view in your controller for the Ajax request, and then you would basically embed that view in some JavaScript that would get sent to the browser. And that Turbo and Stimulus is kind of like a resurgence of that philosophy, but really a lot more thoroughly developed and really able to kind of do all the things that browsers are expected to do today. But we didn't, because we were looking at both of these problems together, we also said, look, there's another thing going on, which is we'd like to bring developers and designers together and have them collaborate on our styles and our layouts and our views together. In fact, we like our designers comfortable with HTML and CSS. That was never possible with our React solution, because with that solution, the designers would have needed to acclimate to JSX and JavaScript and a single page app complexities, which kind of would have been an unreasonable order for obvious reasons. And so by changing by choosing a simpler technical architecture, we also gained the ability to choose just a much more effective collaboration scheme. And so we saw kind of a holistic improvement there. We got more, really, I would call it less waste. We got a reduction in waste. We didn't have the waste of rework because the design was impractical. We weren't building more than the user really needed. And we also weren't doing distributed objects over JSON, which is the amount of defects that decision prevented was pretty almost uncountable, actually. And so the lesson was keep all of your problems on the radar together, because if you do that, you'll identify paths that allow you to take motion with one motion, solve numerous problems. And I think that especially for teams that find that they've got, I don't like the term tech debt, but we'll say their technical asset portfolio contains more technical liabilities than technical assets. If you're going to climb out of that, one of the things that you're going to have to do is identify ways you can load shed and drastically reduce the surface area of emergent problems that are constantly needing to pull you away from new development and over into maintenance mode. And on the flip side, when we're always solving our problems individually, we're almost guaranteed to find our way into local optima, these dead ends where we have little point solutions for every individual problem we have, but the system as a whole hasn't been improved. So your effectiveness as an organization hasn't really changed.
That's interesting. I'm curious. It sounds like you maybe weren't there originally when it was kind of common to spin up like an API with, say, a backend framework like Ruby on Rails, and then you would have like a SPA. There was I do think engineering teams at the time were trying to make a deliberate choice there that would, I don't remember all the rationale necessarily, because I was always like, I don't fully understand why you're doing it. But there was a little bit of like, we need to separate these areas so that the people that are more focusing on back end business logic, and then you got the front end folks, full stack people over here doing, and then we'll just collaborate every once in a while on the API stuff. And we don't have to break everything every time we're making changes. But then those teams are going to be separated. And so it sounds like in that situation, you're kind of, let's bring the teams closer together. Maybe not together necessarily for that organization, but the paradigm is kind of this ebb and flow of like, how do we separate stuff out a little bit so people can be a little bit more autonomous and give them some flexibility to do things without having like, well, we don't need to make a back end change because you want to add some new buttons to the front end, and we don't need to go all the way down to the back end part of that to make that happen. And then what do you think it is about you having been around the industry for a couple of decades now, what do you think it is, these patterns, like, do you feel like you've seen in a perfect scenario where those things can be separated out? Is it based off of teams, or we're having those overlaps of bringing the design? Like you mentioned, keeping all of your problems in the picture and thinking a kind of bigger on a macro level as well. But a lot of teams are like, well, how do I just have an area that I'm responsible so I don't have to worry about the whole thing, because that's just a front end thing and I'm focused over here in the back, I'm air quoting the back end.
It's worth taking a stab at an explanation for why we have these sort of proclivities. And sometimes, especially with technically minded folks, I like to imagine, what if, and let's say we're having a debate, like programmers are together debating, they're deliberating. I like to imagine what would happen if I could wave a magic wand and everybody is forced to sort of, they get a little bit, for lack of a better term, possessed. But instead of articulating logical arguments, they're just forced to say what they feel. That exercise is just a way of thinking about, like, we're not the best at just talking about what we want and how we feel. We try to rely on argumentation and logic, I think, a lot more than we need to. But what is somebody saying when they're like, I love front end work, and by front end they mean client side JavaScript, which is not what the term meant like 20 years ago, which is another interesting point. But what they mean is, I like putting on the look and feel to things. And the people who approve my work and celebrate my work and make me feel like I did a good job and like my work is valued are people who look at the visuals and the aesthetics and say, yeah, good job. You made it pop, for example. And I think for the people that said, oh, I want to do back end work, I want to make the thing run, there's a sense that I'm going to build the foundation that I'm going to build the software's foundation, for lack of a better term. But maybe there's also the people I want to impress, for example, or the people I want recognition and acknowledgement from who say I'm doing a good job are people who are more concerned with what capabilities are we adding to the system, et cetera. And oftentimes there's also a sense that there's the work I like to do and the work I don't like to do. And we're all motivated to try to find ourselves into a position where we're only ever doing the work that we want to do. And that's another factor. And these are human realities. Like this is what being a human entails. So I think that to have the kind of strong culture that produces more maintainable software the first time consistently, you have to engage in this balancing act where we acknowledge that everyone's a distinct individual with our own needs, wants, and desires, but putting each other in a silo, putting ourselves in silos, is one of the most deleterious decisions to your product quality that you can make. Yes, it's really comfortable, but unfortunately, maintenance, like the burden that we experience of maintenance, the thing that we're trying to avoid is the byproduct of our pursuit of comfort. It's because we delayed discomfort that we find ourselves with problems today that we introduced in the past.
We'll be back with our interview with Nathan in just a moment. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. If you're enjoying these types of conversation, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Not sure what to write in the thingy? You could probably ask ChatGPT to write a good review with you. Just say, hey, I really enjoyed that conversation with Nathan Ladd. That was a great conversation. 4 stars, 5 stars, 1 star if you didn't like it. Whatever. Be honest. I appreciate it. I get the feedback. Producer says it's a good thing. It helps get visibility. Helps our sponsors keep sponsoring the show. So do the thing and I'll keep doing my thing. All right, let's get back to our show. I love that. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking and ruminating about how much using that time frame, say 10, 15 years ago, where JavaScript became more of a thing and people were focusing more things on the front end side of the stack. I just really didn't want to spend a lot of time having to keep up with browsers and how fickle they were in different browsers and different operating systems. Like, can someone else just focus on this and I will focus over here because I seem to be way more efficient at this stuff. Oh, we found somebody that seems to be able to keep up on what new browser bugs and working that stuff out. Great. They do that. I do this. We're not the same. And I never really thought about it more as like it's a discomfort thing. I just always thought as like, well, they seem to enjoy figuring and squashing those things. I enjoy squashing this stuff. We make a good team together. That's working for us. But I hadn't really thought about it from exposing myself to some of that discomfort, or even just getting to a point where like, well, I should probably understand how to solve some of those, i.e. 6 or 7 issues, rather than just being like, I'm just going to toss all those over to Brian because Brian's the first front end developer we work with that doesn't seem to be cursing all the time every time we have to send them a ticket, and so like, and that became like a thing. And it's like, so then your team gets these little specialists because of this. And now I'm wondering how people might be listening to this and thinking, well, our team we might be working as a team, but we have little areas of ownership. How much of that might actually be them kind of leaning into just their comfort zone and not exposing themselves and it's not necessarily a matter of stepping on each other's toes, but do you think there's some connection to there between our perceived sense of ownership for different areas of the code base versus what we probably should be addressing so that we as a team can level up a little bit more and improve the overall quality of the product?
Well, I think areas of ownership. I think that's the phrase you used. I would almost flip that inside out and say, yes, we all have different traits. You get a group of humans together, there's already special traits and special variation among each person. And so you will have people that get energy from building out snazzy UIs, and you'll have people that get energy from developing libraries that everyone uses. That's understandable. I think what the extreme programming movement kind of recognized that did find its way into Agile, I think it's been de-emphasized over the years, is when you see programming as a social endeavor, the way that, for example, NASA saw the Apollo missions and project as a group endeavor, you find that your natural strengths complement each other in ways that you don't have to choreograph. You don't have to say, you like doing JavaScript, you go over there and do JavaScript. You just say, here's what must be done. And of course, you need a whole lot of social protocols to make it all happen, just like every human mission requires strong social protocols. It's not a free-for-all, and it's not an anarchy that sort of spontaneously produces order. It is a balance of authority or authoritarian and egalitarian perspectives. But when you embrace that in conjunction with continuous improvement, something that we get from Deming and Toyota that is very much a strong inspiration, you can start to feed energy off of learning new things. And you can start to feed energy to get energy from stepping outside of your comfort zone. And I think that's the underpinning that makes it possible to allow different people with different interests and strengths and weaknesses to gel as one group. That if everybody is able to really find what makes it so exciting and so fulfilling to identify problems, see a problem more clearly, deconstruct it until an obvious solution just emerges that you'd never have thought of before. And when you're having those breakthroughs with your teammates and sharing them together, there's something that you can feed off of that's way better than whatever you personally prefer to do when you're spending your free time in front of a laptop.
For those listening that might be thinking about their team's dynamics at the moment, and then there's always that pressure of like, well, it sounds nice that you would have maybe the space or the air quoting free time to think about these bigger picture aspects of how your team dynamics are working, focusing on things like as a team versus what I can do in control with my own, in my own localized sense of as a developer, like, okay, I'm here coding. I can think about, there's a lot of emphasis on like learning the tools that you use, learning how to use your editor. Like those are like the things that you can do to just improve your day-to-day little things, but also as a team, it's harder to orchestrate when and where those conversations happen. Maybe even more so I don't know if it's maybe more so in a remote environment or not, but with that async approach there, what sort of strategies have you seen be effective in like bringing those conversations to the non-physical table or table if you're in an office together when everybody's kind of a little bit siloed, unless they do have regular time where they're pairing with their coworkers or have a lot of regular meetings or something. But like, what's been your experience there and how that could be improved upon?
Number one, I think to make what I referred to as continuous improvement a sort of bedrock of your organizational culture, that's a very, very challenging mission to attempt. The way I've seen it find success, and I say find success because I wouldn't claim to have been entirely successful at it, but I think I've definitely been part of teams that have found more success than anybody. Actually, I can't think of anybody who's found more success. It's really important to start as a team and to put a specific qualifier on that. If you're to start out as an ensemble, like let's say on day one, and this can be adapted for teams with legacy projects that maybe have a new initiative and they're in day one of a new initiative. Start as an ensemble. Do not start by handing out and distributing assignments because you'll begin in a partitioned state. And I think gaining the ability to operate independent to have independent work cells that operate more or less autonomously, but still keep one another abreast and still signal to each other when important decisions have been made. That itself is a process that has to be managed empirically. Like this is, I think, ultimately the failure of all of the sort of prescribed off-the-shelf methodologies, whether it's Scrum or SAFe. You can only get to a place where you have people working together and independently at the same time by observing what's going on, seeing that the communication pathways are happening, seeing that information is not being lost or being siloed, and that people are signaling when they need help. They are raising issues to the team. They're pointing out inconsistencies, and they're having conversations every day about how to do things better. Path to getting there really requires observing and intervening specifically for each group, which unfortunately isn't a great answer, but I'll say some of the techniques that are immensely valuable would be work logs. So if everybody keeps a log every day of their activity, what you find, for example, is what would have been called a stand-up in Agile, where everybody kind of goes over what they did yesterday, blah, blah, blah. That part of the ceremony, the core part of that ceremony kind of goes away because everybody just reads each other's work logs before you meet. And so what happens when you meet? Well, every individual work cell can post to the whiteboard digitally, of course, things they need the team to look at. Whether now, if they have a question, chances are they've raised it earlier because you don't want to just stay stuck and wait for the next meeting. But the team can actually discuss matters that the whole team needs to discuss on an ongoing basis, which is. It might look like a Scrum stand-up, but if you understand it as a counter, not a countermeasure, but an evolution of how do we sustain the consensus that we had from the initial stage of working as an ensemble to now having a little bit more autonomy within different work cells. It's a way of staying engaged and together. And you mentioned remote, and I'll just leave with the additional. I think remote work has made the extreme programming inspired sort of team oriented approach that I'm articulating. It's really made it difficult. But it presents problems, and those are problems to be solved. Just like defects in the code are problems to be solved. So when a culture has relentless improvement, I think that's a better term that Scott uses for this. When a team has relentless improvement as its goal, the marker identifies all of the obstructions getting in the way of improvement, and it clears them, whatever they are, whatever form they take.
That Scott.
That'd be Scott Bellware, yeah. He's kind of my partner in crime, co-principals on the Eventide project, but I would also call him my mentor as well.
Okay, I'll have to track that down there. Relentless Improvement. It's interesting. I think the remote thing presents presents a lot of new problems that can be solved. And then I know that you're traveling around in an RV, and we don't need to go into a big long conversation about that. But did you have a lot of experience pre-remote world? Was there anything about the assuming you had, is there anything about the pre-remote world that you miss?
Yeah, I would say number one, those little chance conversations that happen at lunch, those are so important. The ability when somebody is reaching their limits and needs to walk away, for example, being able to say, hey, I know it's 3:00, but let's go to the coffee shop or wherever and get a beverage of our choice and just take a break right now because we need it. That kind of interaction, that kind of the social glue that keeps people together is a little bit harder to sustain. When people aren't overhearing conversations and their ears are perking up, oh, they're talking about Postgres schemas. I was just running into a problem yesterday. I might be able to help them. All of those chance encounters that happen just when you're in earshot of one another, all of that is taken away from you. So it's a little bit like maybe flying an airplane without your navigation system, where you can only look outside the windows or listen to the person you're talking to over the radio. It's just having to work with lower bandwidth communication protocols, fewer social countermeasures to social problems and so forth.
That resonates. And I think there was in person, I felt like I knew when I could participate and help a conversation along, and also be like, I'm going to let them. I'm just hearing that other people were having those conversations as someone that owned a company and still owns that company. But like the dynamic there of be like hearing people over, or just kind of slightly overhearing, like, oh, I'm so glad to hear that they're thinking about those things. I don't need to be part of that conversation either. And I'm like, great. And now it's like a little bit of a weird, I'm just confessing a little bit that like, it's a little weird to be disconnected sometimes. You're like, are they having those conversations? I have to trust those conversations they're having? Or if I find out like, I assume they had those conversations, and I wish I would have spoke up when I was curious about it. But since it's like not like, I can't participate in every Slack chat or Jira ticket or whatever people are working in, so that skill that I feel like I've built up for several years is not being utilized in the same way. And so that's something that I miss about the pre-remote world. But enough about me, Nathan. Another topic that I wanted to quickly touch on is that you went out of your way to build a testing framework for Ruby called TestBench. Like, what gap were you trying to fill when you created it?
Well, I think there's kind of two parts to that story. One of them is there's no other real way to say it. There was dissatisfaction with the alternatives. And both Minitest and RSpec had some strengths and also had some drawbacks. I think Scott and I sat down in a coffee shop about 10 years ago and just laid out, like, it seems like we just want to run test scripts. We don't need mocking frameworks. We don't need parallel runners. We don't need the XML output that you can feed into Jenkins, which was kind of popular at the time. We don't really need custom matchers. We don't really need much more than context blocks and test blocks, assert, refute, and the ability to print, comments and details, which actually came later, because we're very concerned. We're very like, output is kind of one of the two main differentiators of TestBench. There's one output scheme, and it's very much designed deliberately for the way that TestBench is intended to be used. So we sort of we built a minimum viable tool around test scripts whose output was exactly what we wanted, and just ran files as simple scripts. No before blocks, after blocks, no surprising execution order problem, no having to jump up and down in a file to see where a variable is coming from because it's always in lexical order, etc. So that was the thinking, is let's just have a simple tool that works for us. The other side of it was, I was just finding it really, really hard to spot the kinds of mistakes I was making that, like Scott, because we were working together on an app at the time, like he was just spotting all of these mistakes. And at first I would always argue, be like, no, man, this is cool. The way I did it is correct. And then we would really work through it. And then I would always like, oh yeah, shoot. and I had a lot of habits built up. That was sort of one of my big flaws, is a tendency to engage in activities that I enjoy, but not like start and finish projects deliberately with a definitive bookend. So I was often not, engaging in the completion steps needed. So leaving behind mistakes in code and things like that. I wanted to really try to see if I could get to the point where I'm less prone to making these mistakes. And so starting a project like TestBench start to finish gave me a real chance to put myself to the test. And so I was, and really try to improve myself. And so I sort of gave myself a rule. I said, find any problem anywhere, I'm going to correct it. I'm going to stop what I'm doing. I'm going to correct it. I'm going to really try to hone this thing. If I find opportunities to simplify, I'm going to take it. And when anything doesn't seem quite right, I'm going to analyze it. And analysis is really not enjoyable work. Like, our brains really hate it. But I wanted to develop the ability to sort of to do that. And I think I'm marginally better on all those fronts. But boy, for someone like me, it's a constant battle, I think.
Hey folks, it's Robbie here. If your team's trying to get a lot done this year, but you're not quite ready to make long-term hiring decisions, Planet Argon can help. We work with teams that need to move fast without adding full-time headcount. Whether it's untangling legacy code or building new features, we offer flexible support through staff augmentation and fractional development services. Our focus, Ruby on Rails, React, Laravel, Vue, and helping teams like yours make real progress. If that sounds like something your manager should hear about, send them our way. Visit planetargon.com. Again, that's planetargon.com. All right, let's get back to the show. I'm always curious when I come across these projects that seem like someone's philosophical kind of journey with programming in a way. And be like, I'm going to try to challenge myself with this thing. And then to share it, you could have built this for yourself. What was the distinction? Like, no, I'm going to make this available and try to attract other people to this thing. And that might share my vision or our vision, even Scott's vision about how testing might be approachable in the future.
Number one, I think we were always going to be I was always going to open source it, because it's like if you got something that works well for you and it's suitably general purpose, why not just let other people share? But the other side of it is something interesting came out of TestBench. So one of the guiding principles was I was really going to try to develop TestBench using test-driven development, meaning I wrote a bootstrap implementation of its DSL. And then I used that to start from scratch, kind of working inside out to build all the primitives from, the underlying test telemetry to the core, like the kernel of that the DSL uses, and all the way up to the output subsystem. And so by doing that, by the end of it, we realized that I could take the TestBench sort of DSL module and include it in any class. And I now have my testing DSL available in objects, and I can test those objects with TestBench in a way that you really can't, like with shared examples, for example. So if you build some test tooling, and imagine like the test tooling is like, I want to given an HTML file, I want to do the sort of markup validation. That kind of sophisticated test automation, you want to prove that it produces failures when it's supposed to produce failures. And as far as I know, there was no way of doing that with the other test frameworks. And so because we had this module that we can include and actually extend and build composable abstractions, composable general purpose abstractions, it seemed like this is actually something that does something novel, and it introduces something novel to what's possible. So that also kind of made it that made it from a here's a gem on Ruby gems that anyone can use with my GitHub page to, okay, it should have a website with documentation and all that.
Nice. I'll definitely include links for that. So for those that are curious can go explore and maybe reach out to you if they have some questions about it. I'm curious, when it comes to testing, given your experience over the years, are there any testing, say, blind spots that you've seen that teams seem to consistently underestimate?
The biggest blind spot in terms of surface area is also the biggest blind spot in terms of how common it is. So it's a big blind spot that's very pervasive within our cohort, and that is testing is an ancient discipline. Testing of digital things is decades old, is as old as digital things, and software test automation is a relative newcomer. But the field of testing, and even the narrower subfield of testing chips or electronics or the kinds of things that we work with, and then software, that's the blind spot. There is so much more to testing than test automation. And I think developers, number one, it's like, well, my job is to automate things, so of course I'm going to automate my tests, right? But the reality of testing is that most of it is interactive. This is why, for example, TestBench only prints a particular output format. That's not the green dots that conceal everything that happened. It's the output itself, because we're reading that output interactively, trying to figure out, is this explanation in the output intelligible, comprehensible, coherent? That is an interactive mode of testing. We're interrogating what we're examining. So we have interactive tests in many of our projects that are scripts that sometimes they require user input. Sometimes they prompt the user to take certain actions. The literature from the software testing community, I'm blanking on the name of the book, but there's a seminal book, Lessons Learned from Software Testing, really is a good primer to how much more there is to software testing other than just writing automated test files from software testing.
So that was lessons learned from software testing?
From software testing. Yeah, it's a very, very excellent resource. Very dated now. So you'll have to definitely, if you read it today, you'll have to internally kind of sift through what's applicable today and what's a bit dated.
Nice. I'll definitely include links to that as well in the show notes. Don't think I've come across that one before. And then, kind of as we think about wrapping up, we've gotten some advice from you so far, and kind of like for folks in teams and thinking about what they can do as teams. Let's imagine that there's a software developer listening right now. Hi, how are you? Hope you're having a good day. But so maybe they've been in a team for a couple of years and they felt like they've brought up some concerns about, say, technical debt or some issues with their code base, and they feel like when they brought them up, they've heard like, well, not right now. We'll come back to this some other time. But they've heard that a couple times too many, and they've stopped asking, and they've stopped bringing it up. Aside from them going out and trying to find maybe a new job one day where the grass is, air quoting, greener, what advice would you? What could they do today to maybe start changing that course?
My recommendation is twofold: start studying and find people to meet who have studied the same things. Our problems in software are not unique to software. They manifest themselves in unique ways. In particular, all of our code goes into a repository that might as well be part of an alternate universe to most people. And so the quality of the software we write is invisible to everybody but us. But there is a long tradition of studying quality and defects and what makes teams more effective. And I actually mentioned earlier W. Edwards Deming. I think his main works are, I can't recommend them enough because I've met very few people who read Out of the Crisis or The New Economics who are in software and not walk away saying, this is every software company I've ever worked at. And it feels, number one, it feels good to recognize you're part of a broader community. You're not alone. You're not alone, having to face all of this complex legacy code and all these problems that arise from mistakes and defects. There's a long tradition that is open to anyone to join. And of course, I think Toyota is also kind of our North Star in terms of not so much lately with their software work, but their ability to develop a continuous improvement, really actually something better phrased as a community of scientists, their ability to give everybody a chance at meaningful, engaging work by demanding quite a bit from them, but also rewarding them with the satisfaction that comes from being engaged with their job and improving things and making contributions over the course of their career that they can really be proud of. And the leaps in quality that they were able to achieve over the predominant players was kind of a modern wonder of the world. And so much when you read about Toyota is a lot of it's only applicable to product development, like manufacturing, but there is quite a bit out there about their product development system, not their production system. And it's all so applicable to software development.
We'll definitely include some links to all those books that you mentioned there in the show notes for folks as well. I like that advice. Know that you're not alone. This isn't a software problem specifically even. And this is a lot of just the challenge of building quality things in general, I think takes a lot of work. Is there a non-technical, non-programming book, aside from the ones you just mentioned, that you find yourself recommending to peers?
I think I'm more the type that if you ask me about moral philosophy, I'll tell you about what I like to read about moral philosophy or any particular subject matter. So it's difficult.
Fair. What's the most recent book you recommended to somebody?
Well, you've caught me displaying an example of the halo effect. I recently recommended the book A Theory of Justice by John Rawls, which is a work of contemporary moral and political philosophy. Suitably abstract so as not to offend any particular political sensibilities.
All right. I'll track that down for folks and put that in the show notes for us. All right. Well, with that, Nathan, thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us on Maintainable.
I greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much, Robbie.
You've been listening to Maintainable, a Planet Argon production. Editing by Claudia Armbruster. Post-production by Auden Morgan and Ellis Fenson. Emotional support from the letter M. For Maintainable, for momentum, for making things better. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Keep showing up. See you next time. Maintainable.